But so welcome everyone to this month's Synapse seminar. This is a seminar series run by the School of Culture, History and Language here at ANU. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose unceded lands those of us at ANU live and work, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We are recording the talk, but we just record the talk and not the question time. So if you don't want to be recorded, you won't be part of the recording anyway. This time we've got a rather special talk because it's co-hosted by the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. And so I'm just going to pass straight over to the UNCLAS Director, Carolyn Schuster, to introduce our speaker today. Thanks so much, Carolyn.
Wonderful. Thanks, Beth. And thanks to our wonderful audience for attending. And thank you especially to Dr. Sarah Abel, who will be giving the talk today. Sarah has a BA with honors in modern and medieval languages, Spanish and French from Cambridge, and an MPhil in Latin American Studies, also from Cambridge. She did her PhD in social anthropology and ethnology at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, and has now returned to Cambridge again for a postdoc. Dr. Abel is a cultural anthropologist with an interdisciplinary background, and that interdisciplinary background is what draws many of us together from the different parts of the ANU campus, and we're really privileged to kind of hear a talk that speaks to so many different research areas. Her research specializes in dynamics of race, racism, and anti-racism in American societies, kind of broadly conceived. As a British Academy postdoctoral fellow from 2019 to 2022 at the Center for Latin American Studies at Cambridge, her current project looks at how visual representations of the body and skin color, in particular, are being mobilized in the context of contemporary public and scientific discussions around racism, and as part of a broader anti-racist project in Mexico. And Sarah, I believe, has recently returned from Mexico, where she was conducting fieldwork. This follows from PhD work focused on how genomic technologies are created and implemented in ways that reflect and interact with local preoccupations about race, ethnicity, and national identity, drawn from fieldwork primarily in Brazil and the United States. In fact, her fieldwork has spanned kind of many areas, also including Iceland and Cuba. The research is the basis for her absolutely terrific 2020 Current Anthropology article, which was how I first met Sarah, and her forthcoming monograph, which is entitled Provisional Markers, Race, Ancestry, and the Body After the Genome, forthcoming from University of North Carolina Press, out later this year. So we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Abel to today's joint seminar. As Beth mentioned, this is a co-sponsored event between the Synapse series in CHL and the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies. And I'll turn it over to you, Sarah. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Carlene, and thanks also to Beth for organising this event and inviting me to take part. And I also just want to say thank you as well to Kate Freeman, who kind of established an initial contact and invited me to be part of this series. And it's really wonderful to be able to make these kind of connections virtually and at long distance. I just want to mention that I'm in the UK and it's 9 AM here, so so it's a little early for me, but not too early. But I am nonetheless delighted to be here, and I'm just going to share my screen to start the presentation. Okay, hopefully this all works okay. Everyone's seeing that? Yeah, someone just give me a thumbs up.
Looking good, Sarah.
Yep. Perfect. And I also just want to apologise in advance because I'm just at the other end of a bit of a cold. So if I'm sniffing slightly or have a coughing fit, I'm very sorry about that, and hopefully that won't happen. Yeah, as Carly mentioned, the work I'm presenting here is based on sections of my upcoming book, Permanent Markers, Race, Ancestry in the Body After the Genome, which as Carly also mentioned, will be published by University of North Carolina Press later this year, or possibly at the latest at the beginning of January next year. This talk's also drawing partly on a recent paper that Carly also mentioned, which I co-wrote with Hannah Schroeder of the University of Copenhagen, who's a archaeogeneticist who I've worked on with 2 previous research networks, and he's a specialist in evolutionary genomics and Caribbean archaeology. The reference for that paper is at the bottom if anyone wants to check it out later. And both of these works, the book and the paper, relate to my PhD research, which I completed in 2016, and which broadly looked at how the spread of DNA ancestry technologies are impacting both scientific and lay conceptions of race and ethnicity in Brazil and the United States. And this was part of an international research network funded by the European Commission called Eurotest. It was a Marie Curie Actions project, and you're just seeing here a snippet from the website. So it brought together, I think, 13 early career researchers, and all from different disciplinary backgrounds. Many of the researchers were doing projects based on population genetics. I was one of the social science PhD students in the network, and my research kind of provided kind of a reflexive angle to some of the genetic work, which was to do with trying to see how population genetic techniques and tools could be used to shed further light on the histories, kind of biohistories and origins of populations that were displaced by the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. For my part, my research focused on 3 main axes. Firstly, how genetic ancestry studies and data are mobilized in public debates around issues, for example, such as affirmative action policies in the case of Brazil, and also how they've been commercialized as a tool for personal identity construction in the United States, among other places. Secondly, I also interviewed research and industry scientists to understand how ancestry data are being constructed in the laboratory and kind of by marketing teams as well. And what are the debates among geneticists about how these data can appropriately be translated to tackle questions of personal history and identity. And finally, I interviewed users of these technologies in Brazil and the US about their personal experiences with these data, so how they interpret them and incorporate them or not into their own understandings of their family histories and their sense of personal and particularly racial and ethnic identity. And in particular, as I mentioned, I looked at these issues in relation to societal efforts to come to terms with the aftermaths of slavery, to repair the damage it wrought upon kinship links, and to undo the silences and gaps it created within family as well as national histories. And my work, this is far from the first research project or book that looks at the issue of genetic ancestry and its socio-political dimensions. So I just want to mention a few kind of precursors. So my research follows on from the work of Brazilianist and Latin American studies specialists like Ricardo Ventura Santos and Marco Chormaio in Brazil, and also Peter Wade at the University of Manchester, who have also written in these 2 books on the left that you can see here, Mestizo Genomics and Degrees of Mixture, Degrees of Freedom. So they've also written about the particular socio-political dynamics of DNA ancestry in the context of societies that have long defined themselves as mestizo, or mestizo, or racially mixed. And for my part, by bringing together the cases of Brazil and the United States, I'm trying to draw out both contrasts and similarities in the way that these technologies are read in these different contexts, and how they're given meaning in the light of changing and overlapping socio-political discourses about race and racism, also about Blackness, mixture, and the legacies of slavery. And similarly, my work establishes dialogues with that of sociologists like Alondra Nelson and Dorothy Roberts, whose works you can see on the right, who've written about the commercial DNA ancestry industry and the particular way that these technologies are being used by African-American genealogists and root seekers in the US. And I should point out as well that although there's been quite a lot of attention, as well as a lot of criticism drawn to the case of DNA ethnicity testing by African descendant Americans, on a global scale, these communities are likely to only make up a fairly minor proportion of all of the people around the world who engage in ancestry testing. It's quite hard to find kind of solid data on this because most DNA companies don't usually share statistics about their client bases, and some claim that they don't gather statistics about that. But globally, I would estimate that the kind of more major proportion of customers are likely to be white Americans and Europeans, Euro-descendant Australians, for example. And this bias is also reflected in the way that many genetics data sets used by companies are or were originally skewed towards Euro-descendant populations. And this also echoes a broader trend in also in research genetics. The industry seems to be trying to correct this bias and kind of reaching out to more diverse publics. And while companies are still largely concentrated in the United States, there's also kind of important business developments in other parts of the world, like China, for example, and Israel. So although I'm going to primarily focus on how these technologies are being used to reconstruct African ancestries in my presentation today, I want to make it clear that this shouldn't be treated as an exceptional or unique case. On the other hand, I do want to highlight some of the particular issues that these cases bring up, given that they're linked to a long history of anthropological efforts to identify and reconstruct the so-called survivals of African cultures and kinship patterns in the Americas. Over the past century, claims about the exceptionality of Afro-descendant cultures have been mobilized politically to lobby for their protection and preservation, but they've also been used to label these populations as pathological and anti-modern. And for these very reasons, discussions about the legitimacy of the science behind DNA ancestry testing and their potential to reintroduce biological essentialist and deterministic conceptions of race and ethnicity have also been very heated, in particular in relation to African descendant groups. These are, of course, communities with a history of unethical treatment and exploitation in medical and anthropological research, and whose findings in turn have been used to reinforce narratives about the biological bases of racial difference. So amidst that panorama, one prominent line of critique by social scientists and also research geneticists has held that these DNA tests encourage individuals to think of racial and ethnic identity as intrinsically genetic rather than as social constructs. For instance, Dorothy Roberts, talking about the company African Ancestry, which specializes in DNA matching Black Americans to African countries and ethnic groups, argues that, I quote, African-American DNA test takers are paying for a false sense of connection to a contemporary ethnic group in Africa, a connection that could be established through other more authentic means, end quote. For her part, Alondra Nelson takes a slightly different approach in her book, The Social Life of DNA, and she focuses instead on how DNA data are socialized and incorporated selectively into people's identity claims as part of emerging biosocial and biopolitical relations. But if they're essentialist, it tends to be in a strategic sense. And similarly, in my research, I've tried to avoid reproducing normative statements about the relationship between genetics and identity, i.e. that identity is social and therefore can't be constructed on the basis, or shouldn't be constructed on the basis of genetics. I engage critically with the claim that DNA can tell us about the past, but I don't discount the possibility that genetic data can and do intervene in processes of identity construction, even coming to be constitutive of relationships of different kinds. And after all, there's a vast anthropological literature that discusses the importance of biocultural concepts of ancestry and heredity to notions of kinship and personal identity in Western societies, alongside the role of nurture and fictive kinship ties. And in this respect, I'm interested in looking at how DNA test takers themselves assess the legitimacy and authenticity of these data in relation to other sources of knowledge about the past. And my research doesn't only engage with individuals who already define themselves as African descendant, but also those who discover they have African ancestry through DNA testing, and what this does to understandings of race as an ontological concept and as an embodied phenomenon. And I'm also interested in seeing how these technologies are being used within forms of reparative work to reverse the enforced erasure of Black histories from different scales, from national narratives to family genealogies. So in terms of today's talk, I'm going to begin by giving a bit of background about the development of DNA ancestry testing, both in research contexts and as a commercial industry, and how they've been received in the United States and Brazil variously. And then going to take you through the principles of how the tests work, not in a huge degree of kind of technical detail, but I'm going to highlight some of the issues, the potential, but also the limitations of using genetics as a lens for reconstructing ethnicity. And finally, I'll share with you some of the findings of my research among people who've used DNA ancestry testing to explore their own racial identities, or to try and find out about their family origins. I'll be focusing on the way that DNA results are assessed and given salience alongside other forms of racial experience and family history knowledge. And I'm going to end with some brief comments about the potential and limitations of DNA ancestry technologies as an agent for social change and for recovering the myriad kinship links that were lost through slavery. Okay. So one of the works that pioneered the use of DNA to investigate the origins of enslaved Africans was the New York African Burial Ground Project in the 1990s. This is a project that focused on human remains exhumed from an 18th century burial ground in New York City, which is now the site of the African Burial Ground National Monument, located at the corners of Duane and Elk Streets in Lower Manhattan. Alondra Nelson discusses the origins of this project in her book, The Social Life of DNA. And so just to give you a brief idea, the excavation was initially commissioned by the US General Services Administration as part of a routine survey ahead of the planned building of a government-owned tower building. And the team of archaeologists began to uncover human remains, and now it's estimated that there are anything between 15,000 to 20,000 burials at the site. And they initially planned to do a cursory forensic examination, which involved the standard practice of racing the skeletal remains. At the time, a report in the New York Times showed that the team appeared to be rushing the dig and potentially damaging the remains in the process. There's a public outcry led by a group calling themselves the Descendants of the African Burial Ground. And after that, a group of predominantly African-American researchers from Howard University, led by the archaeologist Michael Blakey, were asked to step in. So Blakey's group designed a new research project, which was based on systematic consultation with representatives of New York's African descendant community. They rejected the conventional forensic archaeological techniques that focused on racing individuals, which is to say, identifying them as Caucasian, Negroid, and so on. Instead, one of the main research questions that they decided to focus on was the individual and ancestral origins of the burial site population. And this is a question that they thought they might be able to shed light on using DNA analysis in conjunction with other lines of evidence. So they carried out mitochondrial DNA analysis on 48 of the disinterred individuals. And they found that 45 of the skeletal remains could be linked to 3 DNA lineages that are currently found in high frequencies among populations in West and West Central Africa. This finding was pretty much what you might expect based on what we know about the transatlantic trading routes. And the researchers wrote in their report that they'd not been able to make a more precise estimate of the origins of the individuals because of the scarcity of appropriate African genetic reference databases at that point. And this is to say they were using modern population reference databases as they're comparing historical samples to populations currently living in different parts of Africa. Despite those limitations, the work raised hopes for how DNA analysis might be applied in future investigations as genotyping techniques and the contents of DNA databases continue to improve. And one of the kind of unforeseen outcomes of the project was also the development of a personalized DNA ancestry testing service led by Rick Kittles, who you can see here on the right, who was one of the geneticists hired to develop the technique for estimating the biogeographical origins of the burial ground population. So Kittles actually took a number of years to set up the company, which he co-founded with the entrepreneur Gina Page in 2003. And it used similar methods to those pioneered at the African Burial Ground Project, but for living African descendant Americans. So what the company did and what it continues to do, because it still exists, is it analyzed customers' mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome sequences. And you can, for anyone that's not familiar with these terms, the diagram on the left kind of shows you that mitochondrial DNA is inherited matrilineally and Y chromosome DNA is inherited patrilineally, with barely any sequence changes from generation to generation. So what it would do is to look at either customers' Y chromosome DNA or their mitochondrial DNA, and it would compare them to a database of DNA lineages collected from contemporary African populations, which Kittles, I think, built up himself in order to have a fairly broad sampling of populations in West and West Central Africa. So based on the closest DNA match or matches, the company provides clients with a certificate of ancestry, as you can see on the right, which bears, originally they would just give the name of one ethnic group, and now they tend to give the names of one or more ethnic groups and countries with which the individual shares this genetic lineage. And African Ancestry wasn't by any means the first DNA ancestry testing company to arise or to come up with this kind of method. At least 2 other companies, Oxford Ancestors, which is based in Oxford, was based in Oxford in the UK, and Family Tree DNA, based in Texas, had been offering uniparental, which is to say Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA tests to the public since the year 2000, although they branded their products in slightly different ways. Oxford Ancestors, and what you can see on the left here is a book that the company's founder, Brian Sykes, released around the same time. He had a fairly imaginative idea of giving names of women to the different haplogroups that customers could be matched to. And the idea was he sort of created this kind of pseudo mythology that would kind of get people excited about getting in touch with a prehistoric past stretching back tens of thousands of years. On the other hand, Family Tree DNA saw the tests as a way of enhancing genealogical research. So the idea was that by identifying potential distant relatives through conventional genealogical methods, and then comparing genetic lineages among living descendants who were ostensibly connected by the same common ancestor. The idea was that you could test the validity of hypothetical genealogical links. So this service was initially much more oriented towards people who were already doing conventional genealogical research. But African ancestry was perhaps unique in the extent to which it encouraged customers to place a symbolic importance on their DNA result, which they branded as a way to re-establish kinship bonds and ethnic identities with living and contemporary populations, which had been suppressed historically by the systemic violence of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And I just want to mention another ancestry testing method that emerged during this period, which actually came more from the field of forensic research, where scientists were trying to produce technologies that could help identify suspects or victims in crimes based on their genetic ancestry. So this is a technique called admixture testing, which looks at established ancestry informative markers at various loci across the genome. So that's to say genetic material inherited from all of our recent and direct ancestors. And what it would do is to estimate the likelihood that these different markers derived from particular world populations, again, using contemporary populations as reference databases. And initially, these were usually expressed as roughly continental groups. So here, and this is from a company that I think is now defunct, called Ancestry by DNA, and the groups that it would kind of link customers to were European, Indigenous American, Sub-Saharan African, and East African, so that you can see they're roughly kind of continental groupings. The first tests were very rudimentary. They'd rely on anything from 30 to around 150 genetic markers. In the last decade or so, however, the tests have become much more sophisticated. So using genotyping technologies and much broader reference databases, they can now attribute individuals' ancestry to hundreds of populations, or from dozens to hundreds of populations based on the analysis of hundreds of thousands of markers across the genome. So going back to the early 2000s, these admixture tests were initially met with a great degree of ambivalence. So in the US, for many critics, they looked suspiciously like blood quantum tests, and they seemed to simply invite racist interpretations. However, in his hit documentary series, African American Lives, Harvard professor of African American literature, Henry Louis Gates Jr., was one of the first African American public figures to endorse recreational uses of these tests, not only the admixture test, but also the tests that were being sold by African Ancestry. And he saw this as a way to gain further insights into African American family histories, including the usually taboo subject of historical racial mixing. And in the documentary series, Gates was careful to emphasize that these genetic results should complement people's existing understandings of their racial identities and family histories, but they shouldn't be used to negate anyone's sense of their racial identity, particularly of their Blackness, which he saw primarily as a cultural identity. Now, around the same time, DNA testing was also provoking keen public interest in Brazil. And Brazil is a country that for a long time has been considered a kind of natural laboratory for investigating the biological and social effects of historical racial mixture. And Brazilian population geneticists have been exploring these questions since the 1950s. And in the early 2000s, there was a whole spate of media public interests in features in which Brazilian celebrities of different colours, and just to explain, cor, or colour in English, cor in Portuguese, is the main operative Brazilian concept for distinguishing people's racial background. It literally translates as colour, but it doesn't refer just to skin tone. It also kind of encompasses other racialized traits like hair texture, face shape, and so on. So they would invite Brazilians of different colours to have their DNA ancestry test results revealed, and then sort of create narratives about what this said about Brazilian identity. And unlike in the United States, the dominant narrative in these features was not about tracing family histories or ethnic origins, but rather about showing how, however diverse Brazilians may look on the surface, genetically they're all mixed. So on the slide that you're seeing at the moment, at the top, it's on the left, it says, "It's not what it seems. Black Brazilians are much more white, and whites are much more black than they seem." Veja, which is the magazine that published this, and it's a sort of politically conservative magazine. So it says, see the genetic, the predominant genetic content in the group studied, and yeah, it's trying to make this case that really a person's genetic ancestry could contradict their what seemed to be their apparent racial background if you looked at their physical appearance. Since the early 20th century, narratives of racial and cultural mixture, which are kind of brought together into the term mestiçagem in Brazil, have been the dominant expression of national identity there. And for many decades, this concept was used to claim that Brazil had basically solved the issues of racial conflict arising from its history of colonialism and slavery. And these claims have been progressively challenged by Black movements and Marxist academics who've attempted for pretty much as long as this myth has been around to show how this discourse of racial mixture has worked hand in hand with a deep-rooted ideology of racial whitening, which is something that is thought to be achieved through mixture by choosing the right kinds of matings and the right kinds of racial mixture. The idea is that you could whiten future generations, and all of this has worked together to reinforce the systemic exclusion, spatial segregation, and criminalization of phenotypically Black populations in Brazil throughout the country. So the genetic message that we're all equally mixed under the skin was therefore poorly received by many Black Brazilian communities in the early 2000s, particularly in the context of ongoing struggles to introduce racially targeted quotas at Brazilian federal universities, which was a strategy that was kind of brought about as an idea of how to try and tackle structural racism in the country. And just to bring to your attention this other case on the right-hand side, which is from a feature done by BBC Brazil called Afro-Brazilian Roots. It likewise did a series of profiles on Black Brazilian celebrities, and this one was came out as the most famous. It's of a samba artist called Neguinho da Beija-Flor, who was attributed 67% European ancestry and 32% African ancestry. And this was taken to say that really you just can't tell what race anyone is in Brazil by looking merely at their physical appearance. And so this was a kind of way of delegitimizing the affirmative action policies. And I think it's important to mention these divergent cases to point out, first of all, how hegemonic discourses about race and national identity can influence the collective stories and interpretations that we create from DNA ancestry data, and how they become linked in turn to notions about racial and ethnic identity. And in particular, scientists as public figures can be influential in terms of legitimizing certain readings and censoring others for the general public. So for instance, in the US, African-American scientists and academics like Rick Kittles, the founder of African Ancestry, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. have been influential in terms of putting forward the idea of DNA technologies as a tool to, that can help reconstruct aspects of Black and other ethnic identities. And they've even been involved in pushing for the development of more sophisticated techniques to do this. On the other hand, in Brazil, leading scientists like Sergio Danilo Pena, who initially had a laboratory that was offering the kinds of tests that we use for these media features, they would tend to put forward the opposite idea that DNA testing is primarily useful for deconstructing cultural fictions like race and ethnicity, and they were publicly critical of the use of DNA testing to support personal identity projects. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk briefly about how these tests are constructed in themselves. So from the outset, as I've just mentioned, these technologies received numerous critiques, both from social scientists and geneticists who disagreed about how genetic population data could be converted into personalized ancestry profiles and made to support inferences about personal origins and identities. Critics pointed out numerous caveats. The fact that DNA tests at the time looked at only specific areas of the genome, and they didn't necessarily represent a person's entire biological inheritance in the way that someone might assume. They also pointed out that an ancestry estimate was only as good as the reference database used, and this was also difficult to know how good the reference databases were because most companies didn't give out that information about their proprietary data sets. But at the same time, both companies and DNA testing advocates in places like the United States, where the idea of celebrating personal roots carries a high social value, perceived that members of the public were still very much interested in products that appeared to offer them a sense of deep personal connection to particular genetic populations and regions. And the development of high throughput genotyping technologies meant that scientists from around the kind of late 2000s onwards could now survey much larger numbers of genetic markers more cheaply, and also produce increasingly fine-scale admixture analyses that went beyond dividing customers' genetic inheritance into continental groups, instead matching clients to dozens of what many of them called genetic ethnicities in different world regions. Now, to be clear, the concept of genetic ethnicity, which you can see on the left here, this is a screenshot of an advert from MyHeritage DNA, and on the right, it's a screenshot of my own ancestry ethnicity estimate from Ancestry DNA, which is currently the market leader. So this concept is very specific, rather than conforming a kind of genetic counterpart to culturally defined concepts of ethnicity. It's more of a marketing term, I think, that captures the idea of an enduring biocultural essence that can link individuals to places of origin, even when these ties have been lost to living memory. As a matter of fact, the way these, so if you look at the image on the right, each of these bubbles kind of refers to a different kind of genetic ethnicity or ethnic region. These are regions that are artificially produced. In brief, scientists will target a specific world region or population that they want to develop. They cherry pick samples from their databases, usually prioritizing individuals who where the sample is accompanied by a genealogical pedigree, which links them to the region in question for a couple of generations at least, without kind of exogamous mixing with other the people from other regions. After that, the data are pruned and they're curated to create a strong collective genetic signal. And the new reference panel, after all of the outliers have been pruned out, is tested to see how consistently it assigns DNA profiles to their correct region of origin. The resulting populations are then labeled based on how the genetic distance between them maps onto geographical distance when you look at them on a PCA graph. And as you'll notice, you perhaps can't see it as well from this image, but if I move on to the next one, but the labels tend to correspond to nation states rather than to ethnic categories. And I think that this conforms to specifically US centric concepts of ethnicity as relating to one's family origins prior to their migrations to the United States. So rather in this graph on the right hand side, you'll see that rather than kind of picking out ethnic groups as they might be defined by people living in these regions, it's picking out basically areas that correspond to one or a handful of different countries. And there's clearly problems with taking admixture tests like these as a representation of personal ancestry. For a start, the tests aren't truly personal in the sense that they're supposed to work for any customer anywhere in the world. The test will produce estimates based on the same reference database and the same algorithm. And while the databases can seem extensive, they're often tailored to the company's idea of who its target customer base is. And this is often not a North American customer base, and keeping in mind who's interested in DNA testing and which populations have historically migrated to the US. So while some companies have worked hard to improve their tests for clients who are not predominantly Euro descendant, as I mentioned at the beginning, the West African panels, for instance, this is from Ancestry DNA's genetic ethnicity test. They largely focus on the regions that were influential in the transatlantic trades to the Caribbean and to North America. But for example, they might not work as well for Afro-Brazilians, whose country has a rather different demographic history, and the trade and enslaved Africans that came from different parts of Africa, not just West and Central Africa. The issue of labeling is also problematic. Some of these labels didn't exist 100 or even 100 years ago. They also conflate genetics with geography, playing into the idea that we're all the product of various ethnic stocks that have presumably remained stable and internally homogeneous over time. And in relation to the issue of reconstructing historical African identities, there's also issues with simply drawing a line from contemporary populations into the past. So scholars disagree about the extent to which populations may have moved around or their genetic makeup may have changed, and their concepts of kinship as well, precisely as a result of colonization and the transatlantic trade in ethnicized Africans. Conceptions of kinship and ethnicity also changed in the Americas. So what we're seeing is complex ethnic histories with continuities and rupture on both sides of the Atlantic. And to be able to kind of interpret these data against the grain, users would need to have a very keen awareness of these complex social and transnational histories, as well as a perception that identity can be multifaceted, changing, and contextually defined both today and in the past. And another thing that people often ask me about is whether if you take DNA tests with different companies, you'll get different results. And if so, how are you supposed to know which ones are the right ones? So in my research, I took a number of DNA tests, and initially there was a lot more convergence among the different results offered by different companies. And actually what I've seen in recent years is that a kind of convergence in the results that different companies give, and these differences become more minor. And these, what you're seeing here on the left are my results from 23andMe, in the middle from Ancestry DNA, and on the right from Family Tree DNA. And I think I took these screenshots maybe about a year ago. Rather than a sign that all these companies are getting closer to producing objective readings of people's ancestry, I take this as a sign that more likely companies are using increasingly similar methods and technologies. They're homing in on categories and features that appeal to customers. And there's also chances for clients to contest their ancestry profiles by comparing them with their own genealogical data if they know a lot about their family origins and have documentary evidence about that. So if enough people complain that they're being misattributed a certain ancestry category, the company might look into tweaking their methodology or references. And this is more likely to happen among Euro-descendant customers who have those extensive genealogies. But for example, it's a lot harder for African descendant clients from the African diaspora to verify the reliability of their ethnicity estimates simply because of the scarcity of genealogical data on their ancestors' origins, which is a direct result of the institutions of slavery, and this is of course the very reason that many people are keen to take a DNA ancestry test. And I also want to mention that these are not the only projects that companies offer. Some of them have increasingly tried to integrate their genetic testing features with vast online genealogical resources. And this makes a lot of sense for companies like Ancestry.com and MyHeritage, which were first and foremost in the business of family history research. So several companies also offer features called DNA relative matching, where your DNA profile can be matched to those of other participating customers, and you're given an estimate of your degree of genealogical relatedness based on the quantity and lengths of genome segments that you share in common. And many people who take these tests, it's not a majority, but it's a significant number, people who are already very much into genealogical research, and they're coming to these tests as a way to complement and to kind of enhance their genealogical research. And this is really for them the more interesting part of the test, much more than the ethnicity estimates. Because it allows you to test certain hypotheses, as well as to get in touch with other potential relatives who might be able to share genealogical data with you. And I say kind of potential relatives that you see here, because for genealogists, the DNA data usually has to fit ideally with documentary sources or with oral histories in order to produce a confirmed genealogical relationship. So DNA becomes one among a set of clues rather than having the final word on ancestry. I'm aware that time's running on, and I want to be able to talk about this third section, which is about how users interact with these technologies, to what extent they see these data as reliable, and how they weigh them up against other forms of inherited and embodied knowledge. So as I mentioned, in 2013 to 2014, I interviewed around 100 DNA ancestry test takers from Brazil and the United States, most identified as Black, mixed race, or white. And among other things, I asked them about their motivations for taking a test, their reactions to the results, and what they did with the data. People in the different countries had quite different profiles. The people I interviewed in the US had mainly taken one or more commercial DNA ancestry tests. In Brazil, on the other hand, the commercial DNA ancestry testing industry didn't really get going until the last year and a half or so, around 2019. At the earliest. So most of the Brazilians I interviewed back then were actually volunteers in a genetic study who received their DNA results in return for their participation. And this is an example of the kind of report that they received. And this is from a project called Candela, which I discuss in more detail in my book. And basically they were given their results in terms of percentage of Indigenous American, European and Sub-Saharan African ancestry. And you can obviously you can see from this that there was a qualitative difference in the kind of results that the Brazilians versus the US test takers received. So I want to point out as well that so that often in DNA ancestry commercials, like this one from 23andMe, which I took a screenshot of just yesterday, we often see a conflation between concepts of ancestry and identity. So the idea is that in telling us where our ancestors likely come from, the test should be able to tell us something significant about who we really are. And it's true that concepts of ancestry can be very much intertwined with notions of personal identity. In Western societies, we often believe that we are who we are, in part because of the family, our family background, the family lineages we come from, not necessarily in a strictly genetic sense, but also in the way that certain family relationships and dynamics have formed us. But the idea that DNA ancestry testing could radically reorient the way that we think about our personal, racial and ethnic identity is seen, depending on your perspective, as both praiseworthy and worrisome. So some critics hope that these technologies could help loosen public beliefs in the coherence of race as a valid social or biological concept, while others think that they could, on the contrary, lead people to simply reorient their existing racial and ethnic identities based on their DNA ancestry results. And in my research, I found that the Brazilians and the US test takers that I interviewed had slightly different prior expectations about DNA testing. So the Brazilians on the left, they ranked knowing about my ancestors or my roots as the primary reason for their interest in DNA testing, followed closely by the idea of knowing more about their identity. For their part, the US test takers rarely mentioned identity explicitly, but rather they stated that they had taken the test out of desire to find out their ethnicities or their origins, discover their ancestral breakdown, further their genealogy, or simply out of curiosity. Ultimately, though, after taking a test, very few people in either group said that taking that experience had significantly changed the way that they thought about their race or ethnicity, or relatively few. So in the US, interviewees of all racial backgrounds tended to say categorically that race was a social construct which was entirely different from, or mostly different from, genetics. And the salience and the legitimacy that they gave to the results varied, for instance, based on how much other information they had to compare them with regarding their family history and background. The Brazilians I interviewed, on the other hand, generally had much hazier conceptions of their family origins than the American cohort. And this is not a coincidence. Genealogical research is not widely practiced in Brazil, aside from among sort of mainly wealthy white families. And there's very little infrastructure to support family history research as a pastime in the same ways as in the US, the UK, or Australia, for example. The maintenance of oral histories relating to slavery in African and Indigenous family origins was also very much eroded by the spread of eugenic theories of racial whitening in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that these ideologies, while they're not kind of openly mentioned, or they're not kind of consciously thought about as much anymore, they're still very much operative today. So Brazilians often use a variety of strategies to kind of retrospectively whiten their family lineages. For example, France Windance Twine, in her book Racism in a Racial Democracy, found that working class Afro-Brazilian families in the 90s often avoided naming Black ancestors when telling oral histories, and they would show only light-skinned relatives and acquaintance in the family portraits that decorated their living rooms. On the other hand, it's taken to be common sense that all Brazilians are racially mixed. So most people that I interviewed predicted that they would have some combination of all three ancestry categories, and they were often very put out when that wasn't the case according to the test. But when they were predicting the degree of mixture in which ancestry category would predominate, most Brazilian test takers did a kind of racial calculus that took into account their own color, which is to say, as I mentioned, not just skin color, but various other traits as well as the color of known family members from recent to distant. There's often an assumption that the way race mapped onto the surface of their body would be more or less mirrored by their DNA ancestry proportions. And in her research, Alondra Nelson uses the phrase genealogical disorientation to describe the kind of negative affective reactions she observed among African-American test takers in the US when their DNA results contradicted their personal identity and family history narratives. This was actually the case for about 50% of the Brazilians I interviewed, and yet they didn't seem to suffer the same kind of identity crisis. Rather, they would kind of resolve this contradiction by referring to old sayings about the logic of mixture itself. So the top quote is from one of the participants who said, "Everyone says that our country is the country of racial mixture." And that was only confirmed by the DNA results. Below that, another quote from another participant who said, "My friends thought I would have a lot of white ancestry, a bit more white than black. I thought it was going to be half and half, right down the middle. My mother is negra, my father is branco. It looks like it'll be like 52% and 48%, more or less." The test came out with more white ancestry, and it was funny because some of my colleagues took the test, and some of them who are a lot whiter than me came out with a higher black percentage. Everyone was joking like, "Oh my God, you had more white blood all along," that sort of thing. Many of the participants came away from the experience with the renewed feeling that color was deceptive as a proxy for race. So you could look black but have a higher percentage of European than African ancestry, or vice versa. But this didn't necessarily lead to a sense that color was therefore irrelevant. We should just throw it out the window, and people could just define themselves however they liked. Most of the interviewees were students, and they were all very much aware of the recent debates about racial quotas and their introduction at federal universities, which arguably may have increased a sense of racial literacy, which is another term by Frans Windans Twine, of young Brazilians. That's to say, how their awareness of how their color conditions the likelihood that their social trajectory might be adversely affected by structural racism or interpersonal discrimination, or conversely, that you might benefit from the privileges of being seen as light-skinned and closer to the ideal of whiteness. And in general, the Brazilians I interviewed had an acute sense of the kind of multi-dimensionality of their racial identity. So the idea that while DNA tests could give them insights into their hidden family heritage, this didn't necessarily have to coincide with their color, their kind of embodied racial identity, which they saw as more important in defining how they were perceived and racialized by others. Similarly, both could be different from the sense of affinity that they felt to a particular culture, for example, to Afro-Brazilian culture. And it's worth mentioning that the main source of conflict to this kind of rich, multi-dimensional concept of race was, in fact, the introduction of racial and ethnic questionnaires at university quota and civil service exams, where it's becoming more and more usual to expect Brazilians to identify coherently with a particular race or color category. And this idea of race as multidimensional was also commonly evoked among the test takers in the US. So in recent decades, mixed marriages have become more common there, and there've also been political campaigns to formally recognize mixed race individuals as a new racial category. And some people have suggested that this could contribute to a kind of slackening of racial boundaries in the US, the kind of Latin Americanization of race there, the lessening salience of race in social life. While some of the younger participants in particular that I interviewed were often keen to view their tests as a gateway to exploring a mixed or multiracial identity, the context of the Black Lives Matter movements and a rising social awareness of ongoing racism in the US have also reinforced awareness of how colour and appearance condition one's life opportunities. So in the top example here, for example, this is a participant who said, "Because my experience my entire life has been one of an ambiguous woman, or at least of a mixed woman, I always want to claim every part of me. Now I feel that I can because of my DNA test results. However," she went on to say, "I still go back and forth between saying African American or African and European as my identity. It usually depends on how I'm asked. For instance, the other day I had to fill out a form and it said, pick one. I wanted to pick the other category at first, but I chose African American. So here, choosing Blackness over other or multiraciality can be a way of affirming a political stance in this respect." Another participant said this, "I identify as African American. I identify as such because genetically I am predominantly African American, not to mention that when people see me, they automatically assume I am African American. Just because I have European blood in me does not mean that people won't see me in a certain way. That's just how it is. That's the bad part about self-identification. Just because you see yourself that way doesn't mean the world will." While some other studies, for example, there's a recent study by Wendy Roth and Bjorn Ivemark, who found that white American test takers are more prone to incorporating DNA ancestry categories, particularly Native American ancestries, as a way into their identity, as a way of kind of distancing themselves from whiteness. I actually didn't find that this was a common reaction among the people I interviewed, and it was admittedly quite a small sample size, but people who were attributed small degrees of African ancestry, who didn't necessarily know about it, had rather different reactions. So the top one is one possibility. He said, "I asked what happened when he found out about this small degree of African ancestry, and he said, we all kind of laughed about it because we had no idea." And of course, laughing could mean, this is inconsequential, or it could also be a nervous laughter. We don't know where this comes from. Maybe we don't want to know where it comes from. The second quote is another participant who'd actually gone ahead and tried to do some genealogical research to verify where this small percentage of African ancestry might have come from, and hadn't been able to find anything in the documents, which is not that surprising, since this is often something that people would, an ancestry that people would suppress historically. And she said, "I always kind of knew that based on my phenotypical features, that there had to be some kind of slight mixing of some other races. So I guess it really hasn't changed how I think about who I am, though. I mean, it's not a large percentage of my DNA, and I don't identify as someone who's mixed racially because I'm still predominantly white. It's less than 5% of my identity, and it's not something that I've ever lived with or identified with, and neither has anyone in my family." And there's also a possibility that some white test takers may receive these kinds of small percentages and not see it as real ancestry. They could explain it away as a statistical error, whether because it threatens their ideas about their racial identity, or because they genuinely don't understand how a white person could have recent African ancestors. And since abolition, a great deal of cultural and political work has been done to pull a veil over the rather common instances of racial mixture that took place under slavery, and indeed since. So being able to excavate these connections would require a nuanced understanding of social history, as well as a willingness to untangle and comprehend the complexity of human relations that existed in these extremely oppressive and violent circumstances. And I'm aware that I've run over time, so I can't go further into this now, but I have written about this issue in a recent paper in Science, Technology and Human Values, and you can see the reference at the bottom. It's called Linked Descendants. So there's I just have a couple more paragraphs. Should I round it up, or should we go to the Q&A?
No, round it up first. Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, so just kind of to bring this to a close before we go into the Q&A, I've titled this talk "The Body is Archive," in a sense there should really be a kind of question mark after this. That one of the kind of issues of using these DNA admixture tests as a kind of window into the past is their two-dimensionality. They're on their own very difficult to historicize, and I want to emphasize again that that many test takers who are already into genealogical research will pay very little attention to these results for that very reason, and they find that it can be much more reliable to trace ancestry using relative matching features, which gives you the ability to triangulate these results with various other types of data. And I also just wanted to end with a final example from Brazil, where, as I mentioned, DNA testing is starting to take off, and many companies are attempting to market these products, particularly to the new Afro-Brazilian middle classes. And in May this year rather, a left-wing Afro-Brazilian governor in São Bernardo do Campo, which is a municipality in Sao Paulo state, made a proposal that DNA ancestry tests should be distributed free to Afro-Brazilians in her district as a way of promoting racial equality. And personally, I'm wary of the idea that DNA testing in itself can be a meaningful salve to ongoing problems of racism, which is above all a structural issue that requires political and economic solutions. On the other hand, I want to, I don't suggest that we should see these as an absolute load of rubbish and completely meaningless. I think that there can be something positive to this kind of initiative, not as a way of delivering a definitive answer to the question of who we are or where we come from. And I think often these tests are more of a starting point for those kinds of discussions, or a midpoint rather than, in any case, definitely not an end point to those questions. But I think that these, in kind of optimal circumstances, could be a way of opening up conversations about Brazil's Black and African histories, and not only among people who already define as Black. And they could be a way of, by starting those conversations, starting to visibilize the forms of structural and symbolic violence that have contributed to the systemic erasure of these histories over past generations and centuries. So that's it.